Lady Beatrice Wickham was 36 years old, and London had a word for women like her, and the word was unwanted. She had heard it spoken behind fans and inside drawing rooms, and, once, memorably, by a viscountess who believed the door was closed and was only mostly correct. At 36, a woman without a husband was, in the polite phrasing of the season, regrettable. In the impolite phrasing, unwanted. And in the phrasing Beatrice used inside her own head when no one was paying attention, finally, rather peaceful. It was the 7th of October, the last quiet evening before the autumn ball that would close the season at Lady Hartley's house, and Beatrice was sitting at the writing desk in her father's library, declining an invitation to it. She had declined this same ball 12 years in a row. The wording of the refusal had become a small, private exercise. This year, she had written it shorter than ever. The candles had been burning long enough that the wax pooled against the brass, and the room smelled faintly of melted beeswax and old leather, and the apple wood her brother insisted on burning in October because their father had insisted on burning it. And the only sound in the world was the careful scratch of her pen. Then, into that room, which had been carefully arranged to contain no surprises, the housekeeper said the words, "His Grace the Duke of Avonlea, my lady." Beatrice put the pen down. She put it down because the alternative was holding it through what was about to happen, and her hand was shaking, very slightly, in a way she had not felt for 15 years. "There must be some confusion," she said, and her own voice sounded perfectly composed, which Beatrice noted as one notes the weather in a foreign country. "His Grace cannot have meant Wickham House." "He has presented his card, my lady. He is waiting in the morning room." The card was on the salver. The card was real. The handwriting on the card was the kind of handwriting one only sees on cards that are meant. Avonlea. 3 letters of title, 2 of given name, the J of Julian, severe and slightly leftward sloping. And underneath, in the small lower right corner, where formal cards permit one private flourish, the word library, written in a different ink, as though added later, as though added with deliberate care, as though specifying the room in this house in which he expected to be received. Beatrice's father had been gone 15 years now. He had passed from her in this library. She had been 21. The chair in which her father had spent his last evening still occupied the corner by the fire. The chess knight her father had carved in the year of her birth. Small, dark, faintly damaged on the left ear because her father had dropped it once and laughed about it for a week. Sat where it had always sat, on the little inlaid table beside that chair, awaiting an opponent who would never sit down again. The Duke of Avonlea, whom polite London called the Ice Duke, because he had not married in 15 years, and had not, so far as anyone could remember, smiled in public for 9 of them, was downstairs in the morning room of Wickham House, and he had specifically requested the library. A reasonable woman would have refused him. A composed woman would have sent down a note pleading a headache and let him retreat with his dignity. Beatrice was both reasonable and composed, and what she said was, "Show His Grace upstairs, please, and have someone bring fresh candles." She did not stand to receive him. She remained at her father's writing desk, the unfinished refusal letter folded under her left hand, the pen returned to its rest, and she watched the door through which she had imagined a great many people walking over the years, but never once this one. He was a man who filled the doorway without effort, tall, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, and dressed in the kind of severe black that London had decided some years ago meant Avonlea, in the same way that crimson meant the Prince Regent. And underneath the severity, he was, she registered with a small, startled honesty, beautiful. London had described him for 15 years as cold. London had not, in any of those descriptions, mentioned that he was beautiful. Beatrice, who had once been the kind of girl who noticed such things, found that she was still capable of noticing, which she also noted, the way a botanist notes an unexpected bloom in November. He bowed. She inclined her head precisely the depth her station required, and not a fraction more. "Lady Beatrice." "Your Grace." "Forgive me," he said. "It is a discourteous hour. You are not the first guest I have received after the candles were lit. You may even prove not to be the strangest." He almost smiled. The almost was visible, a small softening at the left corner of his mouth, suppressed at once. Beatrice's inner voice, which had been a quiet companion for so many years that she sometimes forgot it was not entirely her own, observed, "Oh dear, he is one of those. The kind who looks at the doorframe rather than the carpet. He is going to be difficult." "You have a book of your father's," he said. "It came into my possession through an oversight. I should have returned it years ago. I find I cannot wait any longer to do so." He took the volume from beneath his arm and placed it on the small table by her chair, beside the carved chess knight. It was a slim octavo, bound in faded green calf, and the title, when she let herself read it without any change in her expression, was Sermons and Reflections of the Reverend James Trumbull. Beatrice's father had owned a copy. She remembered it. She had last seen it on the shelf above her father's desk in 1810. She remembered the year because in 1810 her father had been alive. She also remembered, with a precision that did her no credit, that the Reverend James Trumbull's Sermons and Reflections was a book her father had occasionally pretended to enjoy, and had in fact regarded as the dullest volume in his collection. He had once told her, in the confidential tone of a man sharing a small disgrace, that he had bought it on a wager, and could not in good conscience either read or sell it. The book had remained on his shelf as a private joke between him and his daughter, who was the only other person in the world who knew he had hated it. The Duke of Avonlea had brought her, as a pretext for visiting Wickham House at the candlelit end of an October day, the worst book her father had ever owned. "How kind of you, Your Grace," she said. "My father's library has missed it." "Has it?" The two words carried what, in another man, would have been amusement. In him, they carried something quieter, a careful, attentive thing that listened for whether she had recognized the lie. Beatrice was very still. She let the moment hold itself. Then she lifted the book, opened it once, glanced at the inscription on the flyleaf, her father's narrow black hand, his name and the year 1809, and set it down again with what she hoped was indifference. "You will take some refreshment," she said. "It is the season for it." "Thank you, no." "A glass of Madeira?" "You are very kind. No." His eyes had moved across the library while she spoke. They had moved with the patience of a man who knew the room. He looked at the chair by the fire. He looked at the inlaid table. He did not look at the chess knight, which was the most particular fact about him in the entire encounter, because the chess knight was the kind of small dark object that drew everyone's eye, and Avonlea's eye specifically did not go to it. He had already known where it was. He had been in this room before. Beatrice, who had been the mistress of Wickham House for 8 years, and her father's hostess for 17 before that, knew, with a sudden electric certainty, that she had never received the Duke of Avonlea in her life. She would have remembered. The household ledger would have remembered. The housekeeper, who had served the family for 26 years, would have remembered. He had been in this library, and she had not been in it with him. And that single fact reorganized a great many other facts she had not previously thought to organize. "Your Grace," she said, "will not stay long enough to be missed at home." "No," he agreed. "Not this evening." He inclined his head, exactly the depth his station permitted and a fraction less, and turned to the door. At the threshold he paused. He did not turn back. He spoke into the corridor. "Forgive my pretext," he said. "I needed a reason. The book is yours, of course. The reason is mine." And then he was gone, and the candles guttered as the door closed, and Beatrice sat in her father's library, with the worst book her father had ever owned, and a hand that was, very faintly, still shaking. She lifted the volume. She turned to the back end paper, because that was where her father had written his small private marginalia, the note he had made when he bought a book, the date, the price, the verdict. The end paper was blank. The end paper was very blank, in fact, with the deliberate blankness of a page from which something had been carefully erased. Held to the candle, the indentation showed faintly. A line of her father's hand. 3 words. For my Beatrice. Her father had given this book to her on her 17th birthday as a joke between them. She remembered now. She had laughed. She had set it on his shelf. She had forgotten about it. The Duke of Avonlea had not. The next morning, Beatrice woke at her usual hour, dressed in her usual gown, and went down to her usual breakfast, as though her usual life had not, the previous evening, acquired a small dark hole in the centre of it, through which a great many things she had thought were settled were now beginning to seep. She drank her tea. She buttered her toast. She read through the post. She was halfway through a letter from her Aunt Honoria, 3 pages of complaint about the price of coal, when Augusta arrived. Augusta Wickham, married 11 years to Beatrice's only brother, was Beatrice's age within a month, 2 inches taller, conventionally pretty in the way that aged into handsomeness, and possessed of the particular kind of social radar that had served her well as a vicar's daughter in Bath, and served her even better as the mistress of a London house. She came into the breakfast room at full speed, removing her gloves on the move, and said before sitting down, "You had a caller." "Good morning, Augusta. The eggs are excellent today." "Beatrice, you had a caller." "I have callers regularly. They are sometimes even literate." "Avonlea." "Yes," said Beatrice. "Avonlea." Augusta sat. She did not pour herself tea. The fact that Augusta sat without pouring tea was, for those who knew Augusta, a sign of disturbance equivalent to another woman fainting. "Beatrice. He has not paid a private call on a respectable woman in 15 years. He has refused 6 different introductions this season alone. Lady Hartley has tried 3 times. Mrs. Gransby has tried twice. Even Penelope Carmichael, who is Beatrice. Penelope Carmichael. And he has refused her in a way that has reduced her mother to medical attention. And you say yes, Augusta, Avonlea." "I did not invite him." "That is worse." "Yes, I suspect it is." Augusta picked up the toast rack, looked into it as though searching for an answer, and put it down. "What did he want?" "He returned a book." "What book?" "Trumbull's Sermons and Reflections, my father's. He had it by some oversight." Augusta narrowed her eyes. "Trumbull's Sermons? Is that the dull one your father—" "Yes." "That is a pretext, Beatrice." "I am aware of that, Augusta." "That is the kind of pretext a man uses when he requires an excuse to stand in your house and look at you." "Augusta," said Beatrice mildly, "do not allow yourself to imagine more than has happened." He looked at the room. He did not, to my certain knowledge, look at me with anything other than perfect formality. That is also a sign. It is also a sign that he was being a perfectly formal duke. Augusta picked up her tea, finally, and drank with the deliberation of a woman ordering her thoughts. The breakfast room at Wickham House was a room shaped by long habit, the same chair holding the same body in the same position every morning of the year. Augusta had always understood this about Beatrice. Augusta had also, in the quiet way of sisters-in-law who know each other better than they admit, begun to understand that something at the centre of the long habit had, in the past 16 hours, shifted by perhaps half an inch. Beatrice, who knew Augusta was looking at the breakfast room rather than at her, kept her own gaze on the stained glass over the sideboard. Her father had bought the glass at a sale in 1805. Her mother had thought it gaudy. Her father had hung it anyway. The pattern was a small, dim pomegranate split open, with seeds in red and gold, and the morning light through it was the particular warm autumn light that had been falling on Wickham House for 31 years of Beatrice's life. She had, on most of those mornings, been quite content in it. "Beatrice, I have known you for 11 years. In that time, I have seen you receive precisely 4 offers, all from men whom you described privately to me as either tedious, married, distantly related, or all 3. You refused them with what I considered indecent good manners. You have, since the year you were 28, conducted yourself in society as though you were already a widow, without ever having been a wife. You have arranged your life around the absence of any romantic possibility, and you have, Beatrice, been very good at it." "Thank you." That was not a compliment. That was a warning. The Ice Duke does not bring back forgotten books to women who have spent 15 years not being looked at. Either you have been wrong about being not looked at, or he has gone mad, and I do not believe Avonlea is capable of madness. He may have been bored. Beatrice. Augusta, I am 36 years old. I will not allow myself to entertain a hope I would have to dismantle next week. I have done my dismantling. The wood is stacked. The fire is out. He returned a book. He will not come again. Augusta looked at her for a long moment. Augusta's particular gift, which Beatrice respected, was that she did not press past where her welcome ended. Very well, she said. Then you will not mind if I tell you that he has, this morning, sent his card a second time. She produced it from her reticule and placed it beside the eggs. The card was identical to the previous evening's, except that under the name in the small lower right corner, there was no instruction, only a date. 11 of the clock. Today. It was, Beatrice noticed, without permitting her face to register the noticing, not an hour at which a man of normal intentions called on a respectable woman. Augusta said, I shall stay. You shall not. Beatrice. Augusta, go home. Tell Charles I am perfectly composed. I shall send for you if I require interpretation. You will not send for me. That, said Beatrice, is also possible. He arrived at 11 exactly. He was shown again to the library because Beatrice had decided in advance that there was no point putting him anywhere else. She had also decided in advance not to be standing when he came in, on the principle that a woman who stood for a duke at the wrong angle of light could be misunderstood. And Beatrice had spent 15 years declining to be misunderstood. He bowed. He said good morning. He observed, with the same precise glance, the chess knight on the inlaid table. Observed it without looking at it, which she had begun to recognize as his particular form of attention. Your Grace, she said. I am not quite certain what I am receiving you for. I am not certain either, he said, and the honesty of it landed in the room like a small, clean shock. That is part of why I am here. She let the silence hold. He did not fill it. He stood in the middle of her father's library, neither restless nor at ease, and waited. I will be direct, Your Grace, she said finally. If you have an intention, name it. If you have none, I would prefer not to speculate. I have an intention. Then name it. He did not. Or rather, he named it sideways. He said, I have a ward. He is 9 years old. He came into my house in March. His parents are in India and will not return until the spring after next. And he was sent to me because there was no other reasonable place to send him. He has not, since the day his trunk was unloaded, spoken a complete sentence to anyone in the household, including me. Beatrice waited. I have engaged a tutor. I've engaged a second tutor. I've offered him a pony, a tour of the docks, and the considered patience of 3 perfectly good housemaids. He responds to none of it. Yesterday morning at breakfast he said the word toast. That was the entire sentence. He said it twice. Your Grace. Lady Beatrice. I have been told by my housekeeper, who is the only authority in my house on subjects she does not formally hold authority on, that what the boy needs is to be read to. By a woman. By, in her precise wording, a woman who reads as though she means it. And I find that I know exactly one person of my acquaintance who reads as though she means it. And so I am asking you, with all due awareness of the irregularity of the request, to come to my house tomorrow afternoon and read aloud to a 9-year-old who does not yet know how to receive kindness. She looked at him. Your Grace, she said. Lady Beatrice. You wish me to come to your house? Yes. To read to your ward? Yes. And the pretext for this, because it is, like the book, a pretext, is what? He drew breath. He did not look away from her. The pretext, he said, is that I have asked you. The reason is that I cannot any longer afford to wait. The boy, Lady Beatrice, is real. The boy is not the pretext. The boy is the only honest thing about this visit. He is also the only reason I have left to walk through your door without making a speech I have not yet earned the right to make. And when you have earned the right? Then I shall make it. And until then? Until then, he said, I shall content myself with reading lessons. Beatrice sat in her father's library for several seconds with her hands very still on the arms of her chair. She thought about a girl of 21 in a slate-grey gown beside her father's coffin in a Hertfordshire chapel, about the slow, dignified way the next 15 years had narrowed around her until she had come to accept narrowness as a kind of jewel, about her own letter of refusal to Lady Hartley's ball, folded under last night's penrest, about Avonlea returning the worst book her father had ever owned because no other book would do, and about a 9-year-old boy who had said toast twice. She said, I shall come tomorrow at 3 o'clock. Thank you. Your Grace, I am very much aware that I am being managed. Yes, he said, you are. I should like, in time, to be managed back. Avonlea House was a tall, narrow stone building on the south side of Berkeley Square, with a black door, 3 steps, and a pair of plane trees in the front court, whose remaining leaves had turned the colour of strong tea. Beatrice had passed it perhaps 1,000 times in her life, and had never once looked at it. She looked at it now. The shutters were open. The door was painted recently. There were chrysanthemums in 2 iron pots on the steps, which struck her as a domestic touch and an unexpected one. Avonlea had not, in any of London's accounts of him, been a man given to chrysanthemums. She was admitted by a butler whose face informed her of nothing. She was conducted along a corridor whose carpet was old but excellent, and whose paintings were arranged with the particular kind of careful asymmetry that happens only when someone has thought about each one. She was shown into a room at the back of the house, small, square, walled in books, fire lit, 2 armchairs, 1 footstool, a low table, 1 cup of weak tea growing cold on the table, beside an open volume of, Beatrice recognized at once, exactly the right kind of poetry. She was shown into the room, and then she was, very deliberately, not introduced. The boy in the smaller chair did not look up. He had a worn green book held with both hands at the page he was on, and he had positioned himself so that the wing of the chair hid most of his face. He was small. He had the kind of dark hair that had not yet been cut by a man who knew what he was doing. He was, even in profile, exhausted. The Duke was not in the room. Beatrice took the larger chair without preamble. She did not greet the boy. She did not introduce herself. She picked up the volume on the low table, glanced at the spine, a slim Cooper, well thumbed, and opened it to a page that she recognized. She began to read aloud. She read not from the beginning, because the beginning was for the writer and not the listener. She read from the middle, where Cooper, in the section about hares, had written about a small wild creature he had befriended in his garden, and how it had come at length to know his step. She read in the voice she had used to read aloud to her father in his last summer. She did not look at the boy. She did not change her tone. She read as though she had been reading in this room for years, and the boy in the chair was an old listener, and there was no need to win him. She read for 35 minutes. At the end of the section about the hare, she paused, turned the page, and read about the fields above Olney. The boy did not move. The boy did not, so far as she could tell, breathe normally. The fire crackled. When she came to the end of the second section, she closed the book and put it back on the table. That, she said to the room and not to the boy, is one of my favorites. My father read it to me when I was about your age. She did not say what age that was. She did not say who her father was. She did not look at the boy. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and moved towards the door. Behind her, very small, very quiet, in the voice of someone trying out a new instrument. Will you come tomorrow? She turned. The boy was looking at her. He had, she registered with a tiny, small, honest pang, Avonlea's eyes, though they were not Avonlea's, only the family colouring, and they were red-rimmed at the lower lid, in the way of a child who has been brave for a very long time. Tomorrow is Wednesday, she said. On Wednesdays I write letters. But on Thursday at 3 o'clock, if you wish, I shall come and read to you. We may begin the section about the spaniel." He nodded. Once. He did not say anything else. He had used his sentence for the day. When she stepped back into the corridor, the Duke was there. He had not been there a moment before. He had been somewhere, listening. Or somewhere, waiting. He looked at her, only briefly, and then very deliberately at the wall behind her. Because what was visible in his face was, she realized, more than he could politely show. She did not require him to compose himself. She walked past him to the front hall, and he walked beside her, and at the door he said only, "Thank you." "Thursday at 3, said Beatrice. Thursday at 3. She did not let herself examine what she felt until she was in the carriage, and the carriage was 3 streets away. The second visit was the next Thursday. The boy was already in the smaller chair when she arrived. The Cupar had been moved to the low table between them, moved deliberately, with the spine aligned toward her chair. Beatrice took the larger chair, picked up the book, and went directly to the section about the spaniel, as she had promised. The boy did not look at her, but he did, after the first paragraph, shift his small weight forward by perhaps 2 inches. By the page about the spaniel and the carpenter, he had laid the worn green book of his own, which she now saw was a small Christian primer, of a kind given to children who had been shipped a long way and required a portable comfort, face down on the arm of the chair. He kept his hand on it, the way a swimmer keeps a hand on the side of the pool. But he was, by the end of the spaniel section, listening with his whole face. She paused. "This part," she said to the room, "is the funniest part. My father was always sure he was going to laugh at it before it happened. He was almost always right." She read on. The boy, when the funny line came, made a small, quick sound that was almost a laugh, and was, in fact, the first laugh of any kind anyone in Avonlea House had heard from him since March. He clapped his hand over his mouth a full second too late. He looked at her with sudden alarm, as though he had broken something. Beatrice did not smile. Beatrice, who knew exactly what was required, said as if continuing the sentence, "Yes, I always thought it was the cleverest thing he wrote. Now we shall do the part about the carpenter, and you shall not, if you do not wish, be obliged to laugh again." She read the carpenter section. The boy did not laugh, but he uncovered his mouth, and by the 3rd paragraph, he was watching her openly. When she closed the book, the boy said, in a complete sentence of 7 words, "My mother used to read this part." It was the most he had said in 8 months. Beatrice, without any visible adjustment in her face or voice, said, "Then we shall read it together. On Mondays we shall read the parts your mother knew. On Thursdays we shall read the parts she did not. By Christmas we shall have a list, and you shall write to her in India and tell her which parts you preferred. She will, I think, be very glad to hear it." The boy nodded. Then, in a voice still very small, but a fraction less careful than before, he said, "Yes, please." Avonlea was at the door. He had come in at the laugh and stayed. She had felt him the whole time without looking up. She rose, put the book on the table, and turned to him without ceremony. "Your Grace, Thomas has informed me that his mother used to read the spaniel section. We are agreed that on Monday I shall come at 3, and we shall read the parts she knew." "On Monday at 3, said the Duke, and it was a simple agreement, nothing more. But the way he said it, the way he held the corner of the door frame with the very tip of one finger, made it clear that he was a man who, in the past 20 minutes, had heard his ward laugh for the first time, and had been required, in the corridor, to do whatever it is a duke does to his face when he cannot, in dignity, weep. Beatrice did not give him long enough to recover entirely. She walked past him to the front hall. He walked beside her. At the door he said, quite low, "Lady Beatrice." "Yes." "He has not laughed since March." "I know," she said. "He may laugh more than once a week, in due course. We shall not rush him." For 3 weeks, on Thursdays and Mondays at 3, Beatrice came to Avonlea House and read to a boy named Thomas. She also, by the end of the second week, began reading to a boy named Thomas while a duke named Avonlea sat in the second armchair with a manuscript he was pretending to read and made no pretense at all of looking at his pages. In the third week, the boy began to laugh. Small, dry laughs, not yet free, but definitely laughs, at the sections of Cooper that were funny, and Beatrice laughed with him, and Avonlea, behind his manuscript, made a sound like a man clearing his throat that was not, she suspected, anything of the kind. He made the sound twice in one afternoon. Beatrice, who had spent 15 years being precisely calibrated about what she allowed herself to register, found that she had begun to register it. On the Wednesday between the second and third readings, Augusta, having received an invitation she considered impossible to decline on Beatrice's behalf, produced 2 cards for a card party at Mrs. Gransby's house in Cavendish Square, and presented them at the breakfast table with the air of a woman placing 2 pieces of evidence before a magistrate. "You are coming," she said. "I have already accepted on your behalf. You may scold me on the carriage ride." Augusta. "It is small. 18 people. I have the names. There is no plausible reason for you to refuse, and I shall, if you make me, fabricate one for you in writing. He will be there." "Augusta, I am beginning to think you have appointed yourself my chaperone." "I have. Charles has agreed in principle. He is not yet aware of the details, but he has agreed in principle, which is the most important kind of permission. Wear the dark blue, Beatrice. I'm tired of seeing you in slate." So Beatrice wore the dark blue, which she had not worn for 4 years, and went to Mrs. Gransby's card party. There were, as Augusta had promised, 18 people. There were 3 card tables, 2 whist and 1 piquet. There were small, fierce, intelligent canapes, and not very much wine. There were also, Beatrice noted within the first minute, 2 persons whom Augusta had not, in the carriage, mentioned. One was Avonlea. The other was Lady Vesper. Lady Vesper was small, very upright, white-haired, and arranged on a small, straight chair near the fire, as though she were a reigning monarch giving an audience. She was watching the door. She had been watching the door, by the look of her expression, since the first guest had arrived. When Beatrice was announced, Lady Vesper's eyes moved exactly the distance required to register the new arrival, and not a fraction more. She did not, then or at any point in the next 2 hours, look at Avonlea, who was at the second whist table. Mrs. Gransby, flustered, kind, conspicuously well-meaning, pressed Beatrice's hand at the door and said, "Lady Beatrice, so glad. We thought a quiet evening of cards, nothing too grand." "Most kind, Mrs. Gransby. Lady Vesper, you remember Lady Beatrice Wickham?" "I do not believe I have had the pleasure," said Lady Vesper, who had known Beatrice's mother in 1808, and had been, in fact, at Beatrice's coming-out ball. "Lady Vesper," said Beatrice, with the precise depth her station required. It was not the kind of opening that promised a comfortable evening. Beatrice, who had spent her entire adult life in rooms where small, calibrated cruelties were exchanged in the language of forgetting, recognized Lady Vesper's opening move at once. She did not respond to it. She inclined her head and turned to Mrs. Gransby and asked, with perfect interest, whether Mrs. Gransby's eldest had returned from his travels. She played whist for an hour. She played, as it happened, against Avonlea, with Augusta as her partner and a young Mr. Thornton as his. She and Avonlea did not, across the green felt of the card table, meet each other's eyes for any longer than the play required. He played well. She played better. Augusta, who had not won a hand of whist in her life until tonight, was so startled by their accumulating tricks that she began to giggle, which she covered behind her cards, and then, when this proved insufficient, behind her napkin. By the end of the rubber, Beatrice and Augusta had, between them, 21 points to Avonlea, and Mr. Thornton's 9. Avonlea, whose face throughout had not changed by a fraction, said as he gathered his cards, "Lady Beatrice, you play." "My father played." "Yes." "He insisted. He said it was a useful discipline." He was right. Across the room, Lady Vesper had not lifted her head from her own card table. She was, Beatrice noticed without turning, listening with great attention to her own partner's small comments. She was also, very certainly, listening to whatever could be heard from the second table. It was, Beatrice realized with an electric clarity she had not anticipated, less Beatrice that Lady Vesper was watching, and more the shape of the air between Beatrice and Avonlea. At the changeover between rubbers, Mrs. Gransby made an introduction Beatrice had not asked for. She brought a Lady Henrietta Lowther, a woman Beatrice had met perhaps 8 times in her life, across the room and said, with the brittle helpfulness of a hostess trying to head off a draft, "Lady Henrietta has been telling me the most delightful gossip about the Pemberton children. Lady Beatrice, you must hear it." It was at this moment that Lady Vesper rose from her chair and crossed the room. She did so unhurriedly, with the particular slow precision of a woman whose every movement in a drawing room had been studied for 40 years to maximize the interpretive weight of each step. She arrived at Beatrice's elbow exactly as Lady Henrietta opened her mouth. "Lady Beatrice," said Lady Vesper, "do allow me to take you to the fire. I find drafts at our age quite unforgiving." It was the first cut. It was lightly done. Mrs. Gransby's face went pink with relief at having been spared. Lady Henrietta retreated. Beatrice took Lady Vesper's offered arm, because to refuse it in the public room would have been the kind of public defeat Lady Vesper was setting up, and was conducted, as one is conducted to a tribunal, to the chair by the fire. "Sit," said Lady Vesper. Beatrice sat. Lady Vesper sat opposite, on her small, straight chair, and arranged her grey silk skirt with the dispassion of a woman selecting an instrument from a drawer. "You will forgive me," she said, "if I am direct. I have not the patience, at my age, for the long approach. You are seen, of an evening, in His Grace the Duke of Avonlea's house. You are seen often. You are seen reading, I am told, to the boy. The boy is, I shall not deny it, a charming child. The reading is very kind. London has, this season, been remarkably charitable in its interpretation." "Has it?" It had, Lady Vesper said, by her dear. Charity, however, was, as Beatrice would know, a renewable resource. It would, in time, run out, and the interpretation would sharpen. Lady Vesper should not, she said, like to see it sharpen against her. Beatrice was a woman whom Lady Vesper had known as a child. She had known Beatrice's mother, who had been a friend in the years before Lady Vesper's own marriage, and who had been, by the end of that decade, a great deal kinder to Lady Vesper than Lady Vesper had perhaps deserved. She should consider it, she said, a small late repayment of her good office to advise her friend's daughter. The repayment was a fine pretext. Beatrice noted it with the cold, internal precision she had begun to employ for Lady Vesper's sentences. Her mother had not, in any year of her life, considered Lady Vesper a friend. She had written about her in 3 inherited journals as very wearying and altogether too long in any room she enters. That Lady Vesper had now annexed Beatrice's mother as the warrant for an unsolicited intervention was the sort of small theft the woman across from her had been committing with the texture of conversation for 40 years. Beatrice did not challenge it. To challenge it would be to confirm that the room was on Lady Vesper's terms. "How very kind of you, Lady Vesper." "His Grace," said Lady Vesper, "is an unusual man. He has not, and I mention this only for context, paid private attentions to a respectable woman in 15 years. There are reasons for this. They are not my reasons to give. I should say only that the gentleman has been, since his early youth, somewhat attached to a private grief which has rendered him, let us be charitable, unfit for the kind of warmth a woman of your specific age and circumstance might find herself, by way of innocent kindness to a young child, unguardedly hoping to receive." The phrase, "a woman of your specific age and circumstance" had been, Beatrice noted with a small, clean clarity, prepared. It was the kind of phrase one rehearsed 3 times in a hand mirror to ensure the syllables would land at the precise weight required. Lady Vesper's hands, in pale grey kid gloves, were folded in her lap with the composure of a woman who had set them there in advance and had not since allowed them to move. Her small silver watch on its chain had, in the 8 minutes since they had been seated, not once been consulted. She had eternity for this conversation. Beatrice recognized the quantity of the eternity. It was the eternity of a woman who had been waiting, for 15 years, for the right young woman to appear in the right card room, and had at last identified her. "I am not hoping, Lady Vesper." "No, not yet. I should be sorry to see it begin." "It will not begin. I am 36 years old. I have, as you well know, left such hopes behind me." "Then we understand each other." "I am not certain that we do." Lady Vesper's small white head inclined a quarter of an inch. The eyes, very pale and very clear, did not change. "I am told," she said pleasantly, "that the boy has begun to laugh." "He has." A small triumph. "Not mine, his. It would have happened with any patient woman who could read aloud." "How modestly said. And yet I am told it has been you, specifically." "I am there on Mondays and Thursdays. The other days he laughs, I am told, at his housekeeper, his governess, and a particular crow that visits the kitchen window. The crow, I gather, has been the most reliable cause." Lady Vesper did not laugh. Lady Vesper did not, in fact, laugh in public. The thin line of her mouth, however, tightened by the fraction of an inch that suggested, in another woman, a smile being suppressed for tactical reasons. She said, "Lady Beatrice, I have been candid with you because I respect your mother's memory. May I ask you to be candid with me in return?" "You may." "Have you formed an attachment?" It was not, of course, a question. It was a trap. A yes would be evidence of unbecoming late-blooming hope. A no would, in due course, be quoted back to her if anything resembling a yes ever appeared. Beatrice did the only thing one could do. She told the truth. "I have," she said, "formed a very particular attachment to a small boy of 9. As to his grace, Lady Vesper, I am 36 years old. I do not, at 36, form attachments by accident, and I do not, at 36, declare them in card rooms. I shall let you know, as a courtesy, when I have anything to declare. Until then, my evenings are my own." It was not graceful. It was not, she knew this even as she said it, strategically perfect. It was, however, true, and it was said in a voice that had not, in delivering it, raised by a single note. Lady Vesper, who had been preparing a follow-up question, did not ask it. "I see," she said. "I am very glad, Lady Vesper. You will, of course, take care of yourself." "As I always have." The fire crackled once between them. Augusta, on the far side of the room, was watching with the intensity of a woman who could not hear the words, and was reading every breath. Avonlea, at his card table, had not turned his head. He was, Beatrice noted, holding a single card in his right hand, without having looked at it for the past 2 minutes. The flesh at his knuckles was perfectly white. Lady Vesper rose. She inclined her head, the same precise quarter inch, and went back to her own chair. In the carriage on the way home, Augusta said, "Beatrice, what did she say?" "She advised me." "To what end?" "To be afraid." "Are you?" Beatrice looked out at the wet gleam of the lamplit street. She thought about an upright old woman with very pale eyes, whose particular gift had been the reduction of other women's lives to small, careful corrections. She thought about a man 2 card tables away, who had stopped seeing his own hand for 2 minutes, because he could not, in that room, do anything to defend her. She thought about a boy of 9, who had laughed at the spaniel section that afternoon, and would, she expected, laugh again on Monday. "No," she said. "Augusta, I think I am, for the first time in 15 years, the precise opposite of afraid. I have not yet decided what to do about it." "Beatrice, she will not stop." "No, she will not." "What will you do?" "I shall," said Beatrice, "begin to take care of myself, as I always have, and as, perhaps, I have not, until now, quite known how." The following Monday, after the reading hour at Avonlea House, Beatrice walked with the Duke in the small back garden. The garden was the size of a card table, planted with things suited to October: late flowering anemones, the last of the year's lavender, a single quince espaliered against the brick, and edged with a gravel path on which two people could walk with deliberate decorum exactly side by side. They walked for 10 minutes on the first Monday, 12 on the second, 15 on the third. They did not speak of Thomas, because Thomas was the visit's pretext and not its subject. They did not speak of the late-night card party at Lady Hartley's 2 evenings before, where Beatrice had seen Avonlea across a room of 40 people, and looked away first, and felt her cheek warm in a way that had not happened since 1810. They did not speak of the manuscript he was pretending to read. They spoke instead of small, obscure things. The reform of the Berkshire Poor Laws, a botanical illustration he had seen at Sotheby's, a miscount in the parish register at Wickham Magna, which had turned out to be the curate's eyesight. They spoke as though they had been speaking together for years, and were continuing, rather than beginning. Beatrice's inner voice, observing all of this, said, "This is a man courting in disguise. This is a man hoping the disguise will dissolve so naturally that the courtship can simply step out from inside it. And this," the inner voice added, "is going to require an answer eventually. And you are going to have to decide whether the woman who has lived in narrowness for 15 years is the same woman who would step into width, and whether the answer matters." On the fourth Monday, in the small back garden, while the bare hawthorn stood like a brown fountain in the corner, and the wind moved a single dry chrysanthemum on the path between them, Beatrice said, "Your Grace." "Yes?" "I am going to ask you a discourteous question." "Please, ask it." "Why me?" He stopped walking. He did not turn to her. He looked at the hawthorn. The small, dark winter buds had already begun to form on it, as they always did in October, the next year's flowers in their rolled paper. He looked at them for an unhurried length of time before he spoke. "It is too long an answer," he said, "to give in a garden the size of a card table." "Try." "Lady Beatrice." "Try." He drew breath. He began 3 or 4 times. She watched him begin and stop. She watched a man who had not, in 15 years, given anyone the chance to watch him try to begin. He was very still. The wind moved his hair very slightly. He said, finally, in a voice that was perfectly steady, because everything else about him was being held perfectly still. "Because in the autumn of 1810, when I was 23 years old, I came into your father's library on a matter of business, and you were sitting in the chair by the fire, reading aloud to him from a book of Cooper, because his eyes had begun to fail. He could not see the small print any longer. You were reading the section about the hair. I was made to wait 20 minutes for him, because he would not, he said, ask his daughter to put down the book. By the end of those 20 minutes, I had concluded several things, none of which I was at liberty to act upon. The first was that I had never heard anyone read aloud as though they meant it. The second was that you did not know I was in the doorway. The third was that I was 23 and you were 21, and you were the only daughter of a man whose health at that moment was already failing him, and I was bound by an arrangement I could not break, and I had no honorable thing to do except leave the doorway and not return to it. And the fourth, Lady Beatrice, was that I would have to wait 15 years, or longer, or all my life, before I could ever stand in a room with you again, without lying. The wind stopped. Beatrice stood very still on the gravel path of a small garden in Berkeley Square, and she felt something turn over inside her, quiet, definite, completely altering. And her inner voice, which had narrated her interior weather for 15 years with dry composure, observed, with a kind of stunned and ungovernable softness, "Oh, you waited 15 years?" "Yes." "For what?" "For my mother to stop requiring my care, for my ward to be old enough to understand, for Cordelia, for the woman to whom I had been promised, to find her own life, and release me cleanly from the thing my father had put on us when we were 18 years old. For Lady Vesper, who was Cordelia's mother, and who has not in 15 years forgiven any of us for any of it, to lose enough social currency that what she said about me would no longer attach itself to anyone I cared for. For your brother, after your father's death, to settle his affairs and find his footing as the new Earl, so that you would not be unprotected if I came to you and was refused. For your Aunt Honoria to be installed as your chaperone. For the season to become long enough that one autumn ball, more or less, would not be remarked. For, Lady Beatrice, for a very large number of small things to settle until I could ask you the question I have been wanting to ask you for 15 years, and the asking itself would not cost you anything. And you have been alone for 15 years. I have been busy for 15 years. The two are not the same. And in those 15 years, she said very carefully, what have I been to you? He looked at her then. He had not looked at her properly through the whole speech. His face was the face of a man who had just done a thing he had been preparing to do since he was 23 years old, and had never been entirely sure he would survive doing. You have been, he said, the person I had to learn how to deserve. A leaf fell. It was a small sycamore leaf, not even from this garden. It had blown over the wall. It landed on the gravel between them. Your Grace, she said, I shall need to sit down. He took her elbow without flourish, in the way a man takes a woman's elbow when she has said she needs to sit down, and he led her to the small iron bench at the end of the gravel path, and she sat. He did not sit beside her. He stood at a careful, decorous distance. She looked at her gloved hands in her lap. She looked at the small, dark hawthorn buds. She thought, he has been waiting 15 years for me to know what I have, in fact, just been told. And I have, for the same 15 years, been arranging my life as though no one was watching it. Both of these things have been true at once. Your Grace. Yes. I am going to ask you, in due course, to repeat that speech under more formal circumstances, and I shall require it word for word. It is at your disposal. For the present, I shall ask you only one thing. Yes. Were there witnesses to your visit to my father's library in the autumn of 1810, of the kind that might still confirm the date? Your father's man, Hodges, the under-butler who is now retired in Norfolk. I have his address, should you require it. She nodded. Her composure had not, in fact, gone anywhere. What had happened was that her composure had simply moved to make room for a great many other things which she had not previously asked it to share its house with. She sat for a few more breaths. She watched a sparrow assess the hawthorn for use as winter lodging and conclude against it. Thursday at 3, she said. Thursday at 3. I shall expect to find you in the second armchair. You will. And your Grace. Yes. Do not send me a letter about any of this. I would rather hear it from you in a room. Then I shall be in a room. She rose. She did not take his arm to walk back to the house, and he did not offer it, because both of them understood that the next time her hand was on his arm, it would be a different occasion altogether. They walked back through the small garden to the back door of Avonlea House, and at the threshold, Beatrice stopped. You said Cordelia, she said. Yes. Lady Vesper's daughter. Yes. Living. Married, settled. She returned to London last spring with a husband who is, I am told, a kind man and a poor poet, and she is not unhappy. I have reason to believe she will receive me again if I ask. I shall ask, Lady Beatrice, because there is a thing I would like very much to put right. Then put it right, she said, and bring me the witness. He bowed. Inside the house, distantly, a clock struck 5. That evening, in her father's library, Beatrice sat in the chair by the fire and did not read. She did not write. She did not embroider. She sat and let the room rearrange itself around the new information she had been given, like a household that has been told quietly that the master is not, after all, away, but has been working in the small back room the entire time. She looked at the chess-knight on the inlaid table. She lifted it. She turned it over in her hand. The faint chip on the left ear, her father's chip, his small private joke, seemed to have come, in the last 24 hours, from a different decade. There was a knock. The housekeeper entered, slightly flushed, carrying a parcel. "My lady, this was just delivered, by a servant in private livery. He would not give a name." The parcel was small, square, and tied with brown twine. There was no card. Beatrice took it to the desk and untied it. Inside, wrapped in a single sheet of plain paper, was a slim packet of letters, perhaps a dozen, perhaps 15, folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had worn through in places, tied with their own pale blue ribbon, the ribbon faded almost white at the edges. The handwriting on the topmost letter was her own. She knew it before she had opened a single one. She had written that letter on the 3rd of December, 1810, 3 weeks after her father's coffin had been carried out of this house, which had been addressed to her cousin Maria, who had lost her own father 2 months before Beatrice's, and who had emigrated to Boston the following spring. Beatrice had written 11 such letters between 1810 and 1812, when Maria's address had stopped being reliable and Beatrice had stopped writing them. She had not, in any of them, expected to be read by anyone other than Maria. She had not, in any of them, restrained herself. She unfolded the topmost letter. She read 3 lines. She closed it again. She put her hand flat on the packet. There was a second sheet inside the parcel, an unaddressed half sheet of paper, written in a hand she now knew. The hand of the J of Julian, severe and slightly leftward sloping. It said only, "These were preserved because someone asked me to preserve them. They've not been read by any eye except the one that wrote them, and one other. And that one other only the surface of the first sentence of the first letter, which was sufficient to confirm what had been asked of him. They have not, since 1812, left the strongbox at Avonlea House. I return them now because they are yours, and because I have, in returning them, no further pretexts. A." Beatrice sat for a very long time at her father's desk. She did not weep, because Beatrice did not weep at things. She did, however, lay her cheek down for 3 full minutes against the worn, dark green leather of her father's blotter, and breathed very quietly until her breath came even again. Then she rose, washed her face in the basin in the corner, returned to the desk, took up her pen, and wrote a single line on a fresh sheet. "Bring me the witness, please. B." She sealed it. She had it sent by the household runner. She did not wait for an answer. Then she did the second thing, the thing she had not done in any version of this autumn she had previously imagined. She put on her plainest cloak and walked, in the half-dark of an October afternoon, the 4 streets to her Aunt Honoria's house in Bryanston Square. Aunt Honoria, Beatrice's mother's older sister, widowed for 20 years, sharp-tongued and faintly deaf, and addicted to a small terrier named Wellington, was, in October as in every other month, in her morning room with the curtains half drawn against the light, because the light, she said, was tiresome to her remaining eye. Wellington, on a tasselled cushion, did not bother to lift his head as Beatrice was admitted. Aunt Honoria did. She squinted. "Beatrice, you walked." "I walked." "Without sending word?" "Without sending word." "Sit down, child. There is sherry, if I can find the bell." "I do not require sherry, Aunt." "Then I shall require it, and you may watch me drink it." She found the bell. She rang it. The sherry arrived. Wellington moved, with the deep weariness of a small dog who had heard this performance 100 times before, 3 inches further along his cushion. Aunt Honoria poured 1 glass for herself, and a second, smaller, for Beatrice, who accepted it because Aunt Honoria offered nothing twice, and arranged herself in the second chair, with her remaining eye narrowed to a crease. "You have a question?" "I have several." "They will concern Avonlea." "They will." "Begin." Beatrice did not begin. Beatrice, who had organized in her head on the walk over a sequence of careful inquiries, found that in front of her aunt, who had known her mother and her father's library, and the entire architecture of her girlhood, she could not pretend any longer that she did not know what she was asking about. "Aunt, in 1810, in the autumn, did Avonlea visit my father on a matter of business, in the library at Wickham House?" Aunt Honoria did not answer at once. She looked at Beatrice with the kind of dispassionate evaluation she gave a tradesman whose accounts she suspected. Then she sipped her sherry. Then she said, "He visited your father 6 times between July and October of 1810. The matter of business was a small estate of land in Hertfordshire, of which your father held the boundary deeds, and Avonlea required the boundary deeds in order to settle a tenant dispute. Your father, who was a thorough man, would not surrender the deeds without a personal call. Avonlea called. Avonlea called 6 times. 6 times. 6. I have it from your father, who told me at the time, in some amusement, that he found the Duke an unusually patient young man for one of his rank, and that he had concluded, your father's own phrase, mind, that the young Duke was more interested in your father's daughter than in any tenant dispute in Hertfordshire." Beatrice set her sherry down very carefully. The small crystal glass made the smallest possible click against the marble of the side table. Wellington opened one eye, considered her without warmth, and closed it again. Beatrice looked, for a long, unhurried moment, at her hand on the arm of the chair. Her own hand. The same hand which, in the autumn of 1810, had held the Book of Cooper aloud to a man whose eyesight was failing him, and had, she now understood, held it within view of an open doorway through which, 6 separate times, a young Duke of 23 had walked. Her hand, looked at this way, seemed unfamiliar. The fingers were the fingers of a woman who had not, at the time, known what was being looked at, and who therefore now had to relearn the meaning of every gesture they had made that summer. "My father knew." "Your father suspected." Aunt Honoria turned her glass once on the small marble table. "Her father," she went on, "had been in delicate health by that autumn, but his judgment had remained whole. He had decided to wait, and to see, and not to interfere. He had been a man who believed that his daughter's life was, in due course, his daughter's life, and not his to arrange. He had not, after the 4th visit of a particular young Duke, returned the boundary deeds promptly. He had taken, in fact, a small, private pleasure in being slow with the papers. Beatrice asked, very carefully, whether Avonlea had written when her father had passed from them in November of that year. He had written Charles, Aunt Honoria said. A letter of condolence, which Charles, who had been 22 and entirely beside himself, had not shown her. Aunt Honoria had read it. It had been a letter of remarkable restraint, speaking only of her father's quality, and making no reference to anyone else in the household. The young Duke had taken some pains, even then, to be a man who did not write her a letter that could be misinterpreted. And in 1811, Aunt, when Maria emigrated. Ah, you know. Aunt Honoria knew that someone had paid Maria the cost of her crossing in cash before she had sailed, and had asked, in return, only one quiet undertaking from her, that any letters Maria received from her cousin Beatrice in the years afterwards be folded into the same packet and sent on, as they came, to a London address Maria had been given in confidence and instructed to memorize. Maria, who had been, as Beatrice would remember, a young woman of conspicuously little discretion, had told her aunt about the arrangement in confidence on the morning of her embarkation, and had made her aunt promise not to tell Beatrice, on the ground that the gentleman who had paid the crossing had asked her, on his honour and on hers, to return him the only thing he had specified, a small packet of letters, which were, by Maria's account, going to be the most valuable cargo she ever carried, even though most of them had not yet been written. Her own letters to Maria. Of course. Aunt, you knew. For 14 years you knew. I knew, Beatrice. And you did not tell me. She had made a promise, Aunt Honoria said, and she kept promises. She had also, and Beatrice might dislike this, believed that if the gentleman in question wished to make himself known to her niece, he was to do so himself, in his own time, and that nothing Aunt Honoria said would be of use until he had chosen to act. He had acted. Beatrice was here. Aunt Honoria had not, Beatrice might have noticed, at any point changed her will, on the principle that she had expected this conversation eventually. You expected, I expected, Beatrice. Beatrice looked at her aunt, small, slightly stooped, very alert behind one good eye, with a small terrier breathing rhythmically on a tasseled cushion, and felt her last ledger entry against this whole long 15-year arrangement balance and quietly close.
Aunt? Yes, child. He has asked me to come to his house and read to a boy of 9.
Has he?
He has not yet asked me anything else.
He will.
What ought I to do?
Beatrice, I am 81 years old. I have been giving advice to women of your line for 60 years. I have, I think, never given the same advice twice, because the women have never been the same, and the men have never been the same. I shall, however, give you advice now. Listen carefully.
I am listening.
Do not, said Aunt Honoria, mistake patience for indifference. Your father did not, and your father knew the man for one full summer. I have not, in the 15 years since your father's death, heard one credible person speak ill of Avonlea on any matter that had any substance. He has been a very quiet man for a very long time. There are reasons. The reasons are not yours. They belong to a difficult woman in Manchester Square and her difficult daughter. And the daughter has, I am told, recently come back to England and is settled. You will, I expect, have to know what she has to say. I shall provide her direction.
Cordelia.
Cordelia. She lives in Hampstead. She has 2 daughters and a husband I have met once, a poet of more enthusiasm than skill, but considerable warmth. She will receive you. I have, in fact, written to her this morning in anticipation of your visit to me this afternoon, and informed her that she was to expect the call. I trust you do not mind.
I do not mind.
Good. Wellington, off the cushion. Beatrice, finish your sherry. You have, I believe, a great deal to do this week, and I wish to be the one who told you to do it. Beatrice finished her sherry. She kissed her aunt, very lightly, on the corner of the brow that was nearest Aunt Honoria's good eye. She went home. In the carriage Aunt Honoria insisted on summoning. By the time she reached Wickham House, the runner had returned, with a single, sealed half-sheet from Avonlea House, on which, in the J of Julian, were written 4 words. The witness will come. 3 nights later, in the small library at Avonlea House, not the formal library on the ground floor, but the smaller upstairs library, where she had begun, by the 3rd reading, to settle as though it were her own, Beatrice met Cordelia. Cordelia was 34 years old, dark-haired, very thin, dressed in a blue gown so pale it was almost grey, and she walked into the room with the easy air of a woman who had, in some other country and on her own terms, become happy. She did not look like Avonlea. She did not look like any of the things London had said about her 10 years before, when London had said a great many things about her. She looked, mostly, like a woman who had read many books and intended to read many more.
Lady Beatrice,
she said, and held out her hand.
Mrs. Caldecott,
said Beatrice.
You are very kind to come. I wanted to come. Avonlea has told me the broad outline. I shall tell you the rest, if you will let me.
Please. Avonlea stood by the window. He did not, at any point during the conversation that followed, look at either woman. He looked instead, very steadily, at a small framed engraving on the wall opposite. A Dutch interior, a woman reading a letter, which, Beatrice would discover later, had hung in his nursery as a child, and which he reserved as a focus point for the moments in his life when he most required not to interrupt. Cordelia sat. She did not arrange her skirts. She sat as one sits when one has decided to be efficient. She looked at Beatrice with steady grey eyes.
I shall be brief, Cordelia said, because I think you have been brief with yourself for 15 years and deserve a clean account.
She and Avonlea, she explained, were first cousins. Their fathers had been brothers. When they were both 18, the 2 fathers had made a private arrangement that the cousins should marry. The young people had not been consulted. Cordelia's father, she said with the unflinching directness of a woman who had said it before, had been an unkind man. Avonlea's father had been a man who believed agreement with his brother was the price of family peace. The cousins had been told they were engaged. They had not announced it.
We did not, in fact, like each other very well.
Cordelia smoothed a fold of her pale blue skirt.
We liked each other quite a lot. but as cousins like cousins. Not at all in the right manner.
She had already, by then, been in love with her poet. Avonlea, although neither of them said it for the first year, had been in love with someone else. They had confided in each other in the second year, and had agreed, between themselves, to honour the arrangement until they could honourably break it. Then Avonlea's father had become ill. Then Avonlea's father had passed from them. Then Cordelia's father had also become ill, and after a period that had lasted longer than expected, had also passed. Cordelia named these losses without flinching, but she paused after each one. Small, deliberate, observed pauses, the kind a woman makes when she has settled the cost of a thing in private long ago and refuses to perform the cost again in public. Then her mother, who was Lady Vesper, had told her, repeatedly, with great force, that her filial duty required her to fulfill the arrangement her father had left behind. Cordelia had refused. She had refused for 2 years.
In the autumn of 1815, when I was 23, she said, I left my mother's house in the company of my poet.
They had crossed to France. They had lived there for 6 years. They had been married in Avignon. The marriage had been formally annulled, for reasons of jurisdiction, Cordelia explained dryly, which lawyers had made simpler than divorce, in 1822. She had returned to England the previous spring with a second husband, the kind man Avonlea had referred to. Her poet, she said, with a small private smile, remained in France, where he was by all accounts content.
None of this, Lady Beatrice, has anything to do with you. I tell it only so you will know.
She was silent a moment. The fire in the small upstairs library snapped once. Avonlea, by the window, had not turned. He was, Beatrice could see in the reflection of the dark glass, holding himself extraordinarily still. What my mother has said about Avonlea in the past 15 years, Cordelia continued, more quietly, has been entirely the result of her grievance with me, redirected onto him because I had become unreachable. He has never given her cause. He has, in fact, behaved with such unrelenting honour towards me that I sometimes wished he would slip slightly, only so that I might be permitted to be cross with him. He never slipped. He has waited. He has, I'm told, waited specifically. The phrase landed in the room with a small, clean weight. Beatrice did not move. I came tonight, Cordelia said, because I wished to look at the woman he has been waiting for, and to tell her that my mother, who is formidable, will mistake her for a target. I would like, if you will allow me, to be of use against my mother. My mother and I are not on speaking terms. We are, for these purposes, on writing terms, which are sharper. She did not smile when she said it. She was, Beatrice registered, perfectly serious. Will you allow me? Beatrice looked at this thin, bright, perfectly composed woman, and felt the last small ledger entry she had been carrying for 15 years balance itself, very precisely, into the black. Mrs. Caldecott, she said, I should be honoured. In the corner, Avonlea, who had not turned from the window, let out a single breath of the kind that suggests a man has been holding one for several minutes. The autumn ball at Lady Hartley's house was held on the last Friday of October, which made it, by tradition, the closing event of the late season. It was the evening at which London accepted that the year had turned and resigned itself to retreating to country houses and small fires until February. It was therefore, by long practice, the most sharply observed event of the autumn, because every act performed there was the last public act before silence. A woman who wished to make a quiet exit from the season made it tonight. A woman who wished to declare the beginning of a new chapter declared it tonight. A woman who refused to attend was understood to have refused to attend tonight in particular. Beatrice, who had not attended Lady Hartley's autumn ball in 12 years, sent her acceptance on the morning of the third Wednesday and ordered a new gown. The deepest emerald, she told her dressmaker, with no ornament of any kind. Lady Beatrice, no ornament of any kind. The cloth is to do the work. You will be— Yes, said Beatrice. I am aware. She had not worn that colour in 15 years. Augusta arrived at Wickham House on the afternoon of the ball with a face that had been carefully arranged to look as though Augusta had not been crying. Augusta had been crying. Augusta was a woman who cried when she was happy, when she was anxious, and in approximately equal measure when she was bewildered. And Augusta had been, in the past 3 weeks, all of these. She helped Beatrice's maid with the gown. She moved a candle for the better light. She inspected the seam at the shoulder. She watched the dressmaker arrange the train. She did not, to Beatrice's grateful observation, say anything until Beatrice was fully dressed and standing in front of the long pier glass at the end of the upstairs corridor. And even then, Augusta said only, "Beatrice?" "Yes, Augusta?" "I should not like—" "Yes?" "I should not like to be Vesper this evening." "No," said Beatrice, looking at her own reflection. "Nor should I." The reflection was a woman in deep emerald silk, a woman with her hair plain and dark and pinned without ornament, a woman of 36 whose face had, over 15 quiet years, settled into the kind of composure that does not ask permission of mirrors. She did not, in any line of her, look unwanted. She looked, Beatrice's inner voice observed, with a certain dry, final satisfaction, like a woman who had finally accepted that the evening was, in fact, hers. There had been, in the past 3 weeks, a small private war. Lady Vesper had, after Cordelia's visit to Avonlea House, understood that her social information network had developed a leak. She had moved swiftly. She had paid 2 morning calls on Mrs. Gransby. She had written 4 letters. She had spoken, at some length, to a viscountess who could be relied on to repeat anything she heard with a careful adjustment of emphasis. The whisper that had emerged into the drawing rooms by the 2nd week of October was elegant in its construction. That Avonlea was, at last, after 15 years of seemly silence, embarking on the inevitable mistake of an older man's fascination with a quiet, faded woman of his own age, and that Lady Beatrice Wickham, having waited her life away, was permitting herself an unbecoming late-blooming hope, and that all sensible persons would sympathize with her disappointment when, as it surely would, the fascination passed before December. It was a clever attack because it was kind. It positioned Beatrice as the object of regret rather than the object of scandal, and that, Beatrice recognized at once, was the more dangerous register, because it permitted London's finer feelings to do the work without requiring anyone to be cruel. Beatrice had, for the first time in 15 years, ridden out into London on her own initiative. She had paid 4 morning calls. She had, with Cordelia's quiet collaboration, conducted entirely by letter and consummate strategy, begun a small reverse current. She had been seen at the British Museum with Cordelia at her side, examining a botanical exhibition. She had been seen at Hatchard's, purchasing 2 volumes of poetry in the company of Augusta, Cordelia, and a particularly well-connected Mrs. Mortimer, who was Cordelia's sister-in-law, and a woman whose sentence carried weight in 3 countries. She had written to her aunt Honoria. She had, with Augusta, hosted a small private dinner of 14 at Wickham House, the guests selected with the care of a general assembling a small, reliable column. She had not, at any point, mentioned the Duke. She had not had to. The mere fact of her, alive, present, walking through London in a form of pleasant social visibility, had begun, slowly, to dismantle the assumption that she was a woman to whom things were happening. People were noticing instead that she was a woman who did things. The tide was small. The tide was turning. The autumn ball was where it would either turn fully or be turned back. She had not seen Avonlea in 9 days. They had agreed, between them, in the small upstairs library after Cordelia's first visit, that until the autumn ball they would conduct themselves separately in public, and meet only in the small upstairs library for the reading hour, and exchange no letters except those touching on Thomas's progress, of which there had been a remarkable amount. Thomas had, 3 days before, said the entire word breakfast in front of 2 housemaids, which had been, the housekeeper reported, the linguistic event of the season. Beatrice had read with him on Monday afternoon. He had laughed twice. He had asked her, in a complete sentence of 14 words, whether she would, please, be at the ball on Friday, because his Uncle Julian had said she would. Beatrice had said yes. Lady Hartley's ballroom was warm with the press of 300 persons in small bright clothes, brighter than the season strictly required, because everyone present knew that this was the last ball, and the country would be cold, and one might as well wear the colour that one had. The orchestra was already in the third dance when Beatrice was announced. She walked into the room on her brother's arm, Charles Wykeham, the 7th Earl, who had not attended a ball in his sister's company in 12 years, and who was, this evening, evidently and fiercely enjoying it. Augusta walked behind them. Cordelia and her husband, the kind man and poor poet, who turned out to be the second husband, a gentleman scholar named Mr. Caldecott, dryly amused, deeply attached, walked behind Augusta. Beatrice's small column entered Lady Hartley's ballroom in what was, although nothing about it was overstated, an unmistakable formation. The room registered her. The room registered her dress. The room registered the faces around her. The room. Beatrice felt this not with vanity, but with the cold professional clarity of a woman who had spent 15 years not being registered. Readjusted. Avonlea was at the far end of the room. He did not move to her. He looked at her once. She looked back once. They both, very carefully, looked away. Lady Vesper was in the alcove between two windows on the south wall. Lady Vesper was small, very upright, white-haired, and dressed with the kind of austere elegance that announces that the wearer has not surrendered to fashion in 40 years, and intends to be the principle by which fashion is measured, rather than the other way around. Lady Vesper was talking to 3 women, and Beatrice did not need to overhear the conversation to know its subject. Lady Vesper's eyes had moved, the moment Beatrice had been announced, to the door, and they had stayed. Beatrice walked into the room. She accepted a glass of something pale. She did not drink from it. She stood with her brother and Augusta and Cordelia, and she conducted, for half an hour, the kind of even-tempered, sociable conversation that does not commit any of its participants to any particular line. At minute 32, Lady Vesper detached herself from her group of 3 women and crossed the room. The room felt it. Cordelia, beside Beatrice, said quietly, "Do not let her speak first." "I shall not," said Beatrice. Lady Vesper arrived. She arrived with the composure of a woman who had practiced her opening sentence in a hand mirror for 3 days. She did not curtsy. She inclined her head with the precise depth one offers to a woman one wishes to remind that one's own depth is greater. She looked at Cordelia for one cold second. She looked back at Beatrice. She drew breath. Lady Beatrice. "Lady Vesper, good evening. Allow me to present Mrs. Caldecott, but I see you are already acquainted." It was, Beatrice would think later, the small, perfect blow she had not known she was going to land. Lady Vesper had not, in 15 years, addressed her own daughter in a public room. Lady Vesper's social architecture depended on Cordelia being, for purposes of London, absent. Beatrice had simply named her present, and named her present at Beatrice's elbow. Cordelia, who had clearly anticipated the move, inclined her head with perfect politeness and said, "Mamma?" There was a silence. The silence lasted 3 seconds, which is, in a ballroom, a long silence. "Cordelia," said Lady Vesper. The word was flat. "You are well, I hope." "I am perfectly well. And in good company, I see." It was Cordelia's mildest tone. It was, for those who knew Cordelia, also her most dangerous. Lady Vesper did not, perhaps, know her own daughter as well as she had once supposed. Lady Vesper turned the small inch of her body that brought her once again face to face with Beatrice. She smiled. The smile was thin and well made. "Lady Beatrice, forgive my saying so. We are women of a certain age, and it is, perhaps, the duty of friends to be plain. You have been seen very often this autumn at Avonlea House. It has been remarked. You are well loved, Lady Beatrice, and there are those of us who do not wish to see you disappointed." Beatrice did not glance at Avonlea. She did not glance at Cordelia. She looked Lady Vesper in the eye, with that perfectly pleasant social composure she had been wearing for 15 years, and she said, "How kind of you, Lady Vesper. Disappointment is, as you say, regrettable. Let me set your mind at ease. I have not this autumn been entertaining hopes. I have been assisting His Grace with a private matter regarding his ward, a boy of 9, who has been, since his arrival from India, in considerable need of being read to. We are reading Cowper. The boy has begun to laugh. It has been, for me, and I think for His Grace, an occupation of singular satisfaction. I had forgotten how much I had missed reading aloud. I had also forgotten, she paused very lightly, how much I had missed being asked to. Lady Vesper did not flinch, because Lady Vesper did not flinch in public. But the small crease at the corner of her mouth tightened. How charming. Very. Children are, I find, the only honest critics one can find in London. Indeed. I might, Lady Vesper, ask after your own grandchildren, but I have not had the pleasure of meeting them. It was a clean blow. It was a blow that Lady Vesper had walked into, because Lady Vesper had, in her long campaign against Cordelia, made it impossible for Cordelia's mother to know Cordelia's children. Lady Vesper had 2 grandchildren, both daughters, both currently with Cordelia and Mr. Caldecott in Hampstead, neither of whom Lady Vesper had been permitted by her own conduct to meet. Lady Vesper did not respond, because there was no response that did not concede the point. Cordelia, beside Beatrice, said gently, "They are very well, Mamma. Sophia is 6, Eleanor is 4. I should be glad to send you a small portrait if you would care to receive one." Lady Vesper said, after a moment that was, for those who watched, not quite long enough to be a feint, and not quite short enough to be composure, "I should care to." "Then it shall be sent on Monday." Lady Vesper inclined her head. 3 women had seen, 4 had seen, and turned and walked away. She did not look at Avonlea. She did not look at the women in the alcove she had come from. She walked, with the stiffness of a woman whose strategy had been disassembled for her in sentences shorter than she had expected, towards the far end of the ballroom and out of it. Augusta, at Beatrice's other elbow, made a small sound. "Beatrice." "Augusta." "Beatrice, I think you have just—" "Yes." "In about 40 seconds." "Yes." "While I was holding a glass of champagne." "I know. I do apologize." "Do not apologize. Drink it." Beatrice took the glass. She drank a swallow of it. It was, she noted, very good champagne. The room had, while she had been doing the only thing she had ever in her life done that fully resembled a stratagem, continued to hum around her at its usual pitch, with only the 10 persons within hearing distance entirely aware of what had taken place. Within an hour, she calculated, the 10 persons would have informed 60 more, and by the end of the ball, the entire room would understand that Lady Vesper had paid a call upon Lady Beatrice Wickham in the most public space in London, and had found Lady Beatrice entirely able to receive her. Across the room, Avonlea, who had not moved during the exchange, and who could not, from his position, possibly have heard a word of it, inclined his head very slightly towards her. She inclined hers very slightly towards him. It was the smallest possible greeting 2 people of their station could make in a public ballroom, and it would, Beatrice knew, also be remarked. She did not mind being remarked. For the first time in 15 years, she found she did not mind in the least. The carriage ride home from Lady Hartley's ball was undertaken in silence for the first 3 minutes, a silence which Augusta, sitting opposite Beatrice with her brother dozing beside her, at last broke by saying, "Beatrice?" "Yes?" "He is going to ask you tomorrow." "He is going to ask me tonight," said Beatrice. "In fact, in approximately 7 minutes, when this carriage stops outside Wickham House, and his is, I have no doubt, already waiting." "Beatrice?" "Yes, Augusta." "You are quite calm." "I am 36 years old," said Beatrice. "I have been being calm about precisely this for 15 years. I see no particular reason to break the habit in the last quarter of an hour." The carriage drew up. The Avonlea carriage was, indeed, already waiting at the curb, dark and unlit and patient. Charles Wickham stirred himself into wakefulness, kissed his sister on the cheek with the particular gentleness of a brother who had spent the evening watching his sister recover, very quietly, a long-deferred portion of her life, and handed her down. Augusta, descending behind, pressed Beatrice's gloved hand briefly.
"I shall come tomorrow morning," she said, "and I expect a complete account." "You shall have an incomplete one," said Beatrice. "Some of it is not mine to give." "Beatrice. Augusta, go home. Sleep."
The Avonlea carriage door opened. The Duke stepped down. He was in evening dress. He had not, apparently, gone home to change after the ball. He bowed to Augusta and Charles, who returned the bow with a degree of respect Beatrice noted afresh. Charles was a man who reserved his deepest civility. And then Avonlea said quietly, "Lady Beatrice, may I have the honor of a word in your library?"
"You may."
She took his arm. Augusta and Charles, with the perfect tact of family who have decided in advance not to be in the way, climbed back into the Wickham carriage and were driven off. The street was very quiet. The lamplight caught the wet stones from the evening's earlier rain. Beatrice and the Duke of Avonlea walked up the 3 steps of Wickham House together, and the housekeeper opened the door and admitted them, and conducted them, with no commentary at all, to the library on the 1st floor where this autumn had begun. Fresh candles had been lit. The fire was banked low. On the inlaid table, by the chair beside the fire, the chess knight her father had carved waited in its usual position. Avonlea did not look at it. She felt, again, the quality of his not looking at it, which she now understood to be a 15-year practice of restraint. "Lady Beatrice."
"Your Grace?"
He did not sit. He did not pace. He stood in the middle of the library, very still. The way she had begun to know was his stillness. Not absence, but attention. And he drew a breath. And when he spoke, his voice was the voice of a man giving a speech he had revised, in his own head, perhaps 3,000 times. "In the autumn of 1810, when I was 23 years old, I came into this library on a matter of business with your father. You were sitting in the chair by the fire, reading aloud to him from a book of Cooper. He could not see the small print. You were reading the section about the hair. I waited 20 minutes for him, because he would not ask his daughter to put down the book. By the end of those 20 minutes, I had concluded that I had never heard anyone read aloud as though they meant it. I had also concluded that I had no honorable thing to do except leave the doorway and not return to it. I left the doorway. I have spent 15 years not returning to it. I have been, as I told you in a garden the size of a card table, busy. I am not any longer busy. Lady Beatrice, I am asking you, with the formal request I should have made 3 weeks ago, but which I had to earn first the right to make, whether you will do me the inexpressible honor of becoming my wife." The candles burned. The fire crackled once. Beatrice looked at this man, this beautiful man, who had stood in 15 years of silence in order to be standing in her library tonight. This man who had returned to her own letters, and her cousin Maria's address, and her father's worst book, and the boy who had said toast. This man who had given her, in the small back garden of a stone house in Berkeley Square, the only love letter she expected to receive in her life, and had given it without a single line of paper. She said, "Yes," with 3 conditions. A breath went out of him. He had been, she realized, holding it. "Name them." "First, I shall continue my father's botanical archive. You will not require me to abandon it. You will, in fact, on occasions when I require an additional pair of hands for the cataloguing, lend me your secretary. He has very neat handwriting, and I have, on 3 separate Thursdays, made improper use of him already. He has, I believe, enjoyed it. Second, I shall continue to correspond with Cordelia, in my own name and at my own pace, and you will not, even with the best motives, open or read those letters. It would not occur to me to open or read them. Third, yes, Thomas, the boy is mine now. We shall not, you and I, make any decision regarding his schooling, his care, or his future without consulting him as well as each other. He has, in his short life, had a very great many decisions made for him. He will not have that now, in this house. You will agree to this in writing if I require it, but I shall not require it, because I take you at your word. You may take me at my word. Your Grace, Lady Beatrice. You may also now kiss me, if you would like to. I have waited 15 years for that as well, and I do not propose to wait any longer. He came across the library. He took her face in both his hands, very carefully, the way a man takes a thing he has been afraid he had broken in advance, and is finding, with cautious astonishment, that he is not. He kissed her. Beatrice, who had stopped expecting to be kissed at 28, who had stopped expecting it so completely that she had built a house and a life and a peaceful interior climate around its absence, found that her body remembered something it had not, in fact, ever quite known. His mouth was warm and steady. His hands were warm and very precise. He kissed her once, softly, as one might kiss a vow, and again, less softly, as one might kiss a woman whom one has loved without permission for 15 years, and is now permitted to love with full and formal warrant. And a third time, very lightly, as one closes a door behind oneself when one means to stay in the room for the rest of one's life. When she opened her eyes, the chess knight was, very slightly, in a different position on the inlaid table. She had not been aware of moving it. Neither, she suspected, had he. Your Grace. Yes. You may, in private, call me Beatrice. Beatrice. Yes. Will you, in private, call me Julian? In due course, she said. Tonight, I would prefer to begin slowly. Slowly, he agreed. It was 9 days later, and 3 days before the small private wedding which had been arranged for the second week of November in the chapel at Wickham House, when Lady Vesper made her last move. It came in the form of a letter from the office of the Lord Chancellor, addressed to His Grace the Duke of Avonlea, requesting attendance to discuss an irregularity arising from a private petition lodged in the matter of the guardianship of Master Thomas Avonlea Pell, ward, with a view to the suitability of the household into which the said ward was being received, in light of recent conduct of the petitioner-respondent's affianced wife. The phrasing was the kind of careful that conceals nothing. The petitioner was identified in the third paragraph as Lady Eulalia Vesper, Dowager, of Manchester Square, who had submitted her petition under the rule of standing extended to senior female relatives of children of the Avonlea Pell line, on the ground that recent and remarkable changes in the said household, namely the engagement of His Grace to Lady Beatrice Wickham, gave rise to a concern as to the moral and educational climate into which the boy was being installed. Avonlea read the letter without speaking. He brought it to Beatrice the same afternoon, in the small upstairs library, and laid it on the low table. This is unworthy. Yes, said Beatrice, scanning. It is. It is also a letter from the office of the Lord Chancellor. Beatrice, I shall handle it. Julian. Yes? You will not handle it. We shall handle it. She has chosen the wrong ground. Beatrice. She has petitioned a court of equity. A court of equity weighs character. She has set my character on the scales without, and this is her error, taking into account whose names will be willing to be set there with mine. I have, in the past 3 weeks, been collecting names. She rose. She crossed to her father's desk, opened the lower right drawer, and removed a small folder. She placed it on the table, beside the Lord Chancellor's letter. Cordelia has written to me. Mr. Caldecott has written. Augusta and Charles have written. My Aunt Honoria has written. Mrs. Mortimer has written. Mrs. Gransby, and you will appreciate this, Julian, has written, and has been, in fact, very angry on my behalf, and has used an underline. The vicar at Wickham Magna has written. 2 of my late father's surviving colleagues from the Royal Society have written. Hodges, the under-butler your visit to my father's library was conducted in front of, has written, in a hand that is admirably plain, and carries the date of October 1810 in his own copy of the household ledger. We have in this folder 14 voluntary letters, and we have not yet asked the petitioner-respondent's affianced wife herself, who I understand has a number of her own observations to add. Avonlea looked at the folder. He looked at her. He drew breath and let it out, and a small, slow smile. The first full smile she had ever seen him permit in a room with light in it, rose on his face. "You have been busy." "I have been, as you put it some weeks ago, busy. The two are not the same, as alone." "Beatrice?" "Yes. I shall see her in the office of the Lord Chancellor on Monday morning. I shall take you with me. I shall take, with us, this folder. I shall also take Cordelia, who has informed me by personal note that she requires no permission to attend, and Mr. Caldecott, who is quietly furious. We shall, I think, settle this petition before the noon hour." "And Thomas?" "Thomas," said Avonlea, "shall not be informed that any of this happened, until he is old enough to find it educational rather than alarming, by which time it shall be a story we tell him over tea." The Lord Chancellor, on Monday morning, was a tired man, with a desk that contained more pressing matters, and who did not, to Beatrice's immediate observation, regard Lady Vesper's petition as the most inspiring document of his week. He listened. He read the 14 letters. He looked for some time at Hodge's old household ledger entry. He looked, longest of all, at Cordelia, who sat composedly between Mr. Caldecott and Avonlea, and who answered 3 direct questions with a precision that suggested a woman who had been preparing her answers since September. The Lord Chancellor listened to Cordelia. He listened to Mr. Caldecott. He listened, very briefly, to Beatrice. He did not look at Lady Vesper. He found against the petition. He found against it, in his careful written language, on the ground that it disclosed no facts justifying inquiry, that the engagement of His Grace to Lady Beatrice Wickham was, on the contrary, supported by the considered and voluntary attestation of 14 persons of independent character, that the petitioner had standing as a senior relative, but had not exercised that standing in the relevant decade, and that the boy in question was, by all accounts before the office, presently in the most stable circumstances he had enjoyed since his arrival in England. The petition was dismissed. Lady Vesper was, by clean phrasing and without publicity, told to go home. She went home. She did not, in the 7 months that followed before Sophia and Eleanor were brought to her drawing-room for the first time by their mother, write any further letters of any kind to anyone connected to the Avonlea Pell line. The first time her granddaughters were brought to her, she received them in a small grey gown, with her hair plain and unornamented, and offered them gingerbread biscuits, which she had baked herself. And Cordelia, who told Beatrice this story afterwards over tea at Wickham House, said her mother had wept for an hour after they had gone, and had requested, in a steadier voice the following week, that Cordelia please bring the children again. "I shall," Cordelia had said. "I am sorry." "I know, Mamma. I have been—" "I know, Mamma." Beatrice and Julian Avonlea were married on a Tuesday afternoon in the 2nd week of November, in the small chapel at Wickham House, in a private ceremony attended by 12 people. The chapel was lit by ordinary candles. The bride wore the deep emerald gown she had worn to Lady Hartley's autumn ball, because it was, she had decided privately, the gown in which she had become the woman she was marrying him as. Augusta wept twice. Charles delivered her hand with an expression of grave, brotherly pride. The boy Thomas, small, neatly brushed, holding the gold ring on a small velvet cushion, as though he had been entrusted with the most serious object in the world, stood beside his uncle for the entire ceremony, and did not speak until the very end, when he was permitted to say to Beatrice, in a voice Beatrice would remember the rest of her life, "I am very glad, please." At the moment Beatrice and Julian were declared by the vicar to be man and wife, the Duke turned to his bride and said quietly, in a voice meant only for the two of them, "I have waited 15 years for this sentence." Beatrice, who had been determined to remain perfectly composed throughout the entire ceremony, who had in fact remained perfectly composed throughout, nodded once. She did not, even now, weep. She did, however, lift the small carved chess knight which she had brought from her father's library, and slipped, on the morning of the wedding, into her glove, and she set it down on the small altar table, beside the prayer book, where it had no formal business to be, and where it had, in some private way she had not yet articulated, every business to be. It was the 2nd week of May, 6 months after the wedding, in the small upstairs library at Avonlea House, which had become, by quiet and undiscussed agreement between the Duke and the Duchess, the room where the household lived. The small back garden was full of cherry blossom. The plane trees in the front court were in fresh, pale green. The boy, Thomas, was 9.5, 3 inches taller than he had been in October, and he had developed an alarming habit of speaking in long sentences with subordinate clauses, which his uncle bore with public patience and private delight. Beatrice was sitting in the second armchair. They had, by silent agreement, swapped chairs at some point in the spring. She had taken his and he had taken hers, and neither of them, when this had happened, had remarked it. She had a sheet of foolscap on her knee. She was making a note for the second volume of the botanical catalogue. The window behind her was open. The smell of cherry blossom and bread baking drifted in. On the low table between her and the Duke, the chess knight her father had carved sat in its usual position. They had brought it from Wickham House in November, on the day Beatrice had, formally, become mistress of 2 houses. She had set it on this table, in this room, without consulting anyone, and Avonlea had not consulted her in turn. It had simply been understood that the knight came too. She moved it forward 2 squares. Avonlea, who had been pretending to read the same manuscript he had been pretending to read for 7 months, looked up from his page. He looked at the knight. He looked at Beatrice. The faint chip on the left ear of the knight, her father's chip, the small evidence of a man who had laughed in this house 20 years before her, caught the late afternoon light. Beatrice. Yes? Are we, in fact, beginning a game? We are. I propose we begin gently. Gently. Yes. I do not, at 36.5, intend to be hurried. Nor I, at 38.5, to hurry you. You are very good. I am very fortunate. The light through the open window was warm and pale, and exactly the color of a spring afternoon in London at the end of a long, kind day. Somewhere down the corridor, a boy of 9.5, who had been silent for 6 months in his uncle's house, and had been speaking now in long sentences for 7, called something cheerful to his governess. Beatrice listened to him, and to the leaves moving against the window frame, and to the small, dry sound of her husband turning a page of the manuscript he was, even now, mostly pretending to read. She lifted her hand from the chess knight and rested it, palm down, on the low table between them. The Duke set down his manuscript. He reached across the table without flourish. He laid his hand over hers, warm, steady, fitted to it, and around their joined hands, the small, dark, carved knight from her father's hand stood between them like a marker on a long, slow journey that had, at last, arrived where it was always quietly going. Outside, a bird Beatrice could not name began, into the pale spring air, to sing. If you have ever been told, by people who could not see you clearly, that you were too old, or too quiet, or too long alone for love to find you again, and if you have, in spite of that, kept the small private knight on your father's table where it has always sat, waiting for the right opponent to sit down, then I wrote this story for you. I think they read each other's silences for 15 years, and I think when the silence finally broke, it broke quietly, and I think Lady Beatrice Wickham had the autumn she deserved. If a particular line stayed with you, a moment in a small back garden, a packet of letters returned, a boy who said toast, leave it for me below. I read every one. There is one more story waiting by this fire, and if you stay, I shall begin it.